Spring arrived in Brookdale with gentle rain and soft winds. The snow had melted and the streets were full of blooming flowers again. The whole city seemed alive, brighter, kinder, and full of hope. Officer Mark Davis stood near the community park, watching a group of children play under the fresh green trees. This park was the same one that Judge Ruth Harris had fought to protect. Now it was full of laughter and life. Every time Mark saw it, he felt proud, not just of himself, but of the change that had come to Brookdale. But deep down, he also felt something else, a quiet sense that his journey was not yet complete. A sudden news one morning, while Mark was reviewing files at his desk, Captain Reed entered with a serious look. "Davis," he said, "got a minute?" Mark stood up immediately. "Of course, sir." Reed handed him a folder. "Judge Harris is being considered for the state Supreme Court bench. The committee has requested background reports from people who've worked with her. They've asked you to give a testimonial." Mark blinked. "Me?" "Yes," Reed replied. "They said you've had direct experience with her in both professional and community matters. They trust your words." Mark nodded slowly, feeling both honored and nervous. "I'll do it." "Good," Reed said. "Be honest but careful. It's a big step for her, and for this city." As the captain left, Mark sat down again, opening the folder. He saw her name printed neatly across the top. Judge Ruth Harris, candidate for state Supreme Court. He smiled faintly. "You deserve this," he whispered to himself. Writing the testimonial that night, Mark stayed late at his desk. He opened a blank document and stared at it for a long time. How could he put into words everything Ruth had taught him, about fairness, compassion, and second chances? Finally, he began to type. Judge Ruth Harris represents what justice should truly mean. She believes that the law must protect not only those who follow it, but also those who have lost their way. Her integrity, patience, and courage have changed lives, including my own. He paused, remembering the night he had once treated her unfairly during an arrest, back when he didn't know who she was. The memory still stung, but it also reminded him how far he had come. He continued typing. When I was assigned to a review involving Judge Harris, I saw firsthand how she handled false accusations with calm strength. She never blamed anyone. She trusted the process and let truth speak for itself. I learned from her that real strength is quiet, and that justice is not about pride but humility. He leaned back, reading what he had written. It felt honest, true. Before midnight, he finished his testimonial and sent it to the committee, a surprise visit. 2 days later, Judge Harris stopped by the police station. Mark was surprised to see her. She rarely came to the station herself. "Judge Harris," he said, standing up quickly. "This is unexpected," she smiled. "I heard you were the one writing a testimonial for the review board." Mark looked a bit shy. "Yes, I hope that's all right." "It's more than all right," she said softly. "I just wanted to thank you in person." He smiled. "You don't need to thank me. You earned every word of it." They sat down for a moment in the small office. The sound of police radios filled the background. Ruth looked thoughtful. "You know, Mark, when we first met, I didn't expect our paths to cross so many times, but I'm glad they did. You remind me that even in this world of rules and power, kindness still matters." Mark nodded. "You reminded me that mercy and justice can exist together." She smiled gently. "Then we've both learned something." The hearing day. A few weeks later, the State Judicial Committee held the public hearing for Judge Harris's nomination. The courtroom was full. Lawyers, reporters, officials, and community members filled every seat. Mark sat near the back, quietly observing. He wasn't there as an officer today, but as someone who wanted to support a person who had once believed in him. When Ruth entered, the room stood up in respect. She wore her black robe, but her calm smile showed her true character. The committee chair began asking questions about her career, her values, and the meaning of justice. One member asked, "Judge Harris, have you ever faced false accusations? And how did you handle them?" Ruth answered steadily, "Yes, I once faced a false complaint. It taught me that truth does not need to shout. It simply needs time to be seen. I trusted the process and the people who still believed in fairness." Mark smiled faintly. He knew she was talking about him without saying his name. Another member said, "Several letters describe you as compassionate but firm. How do you balance mercy with the law?" She replied, "Mercy without law becomes chaos. Law without mercy becomes cruelty." Balance is not written in the books, it's written in the heart. The room was silent for a moment. Even the toughest committee members seemed moved. When it was time for public testimonials, Mark was called unexpectedly. He stood up slowly, heart pounding, and walked to the front. "Officer Mark Davis," the chair said. "You've worked with Judge Harris, correct?" "Yes, sir," Mark replied. "I have, both in the courtroom and in community projects. Please share your experience." Mark took a breath. "Judge Harris doesn't just follow the law, she lives it. I've seen her defend truth even when it was unpopular. I've seen her protect people who couldn't protect themselves. She changed how I see justice, not as punishment, but as a chance to do better." He looked toward Ruth briefly, then back to the committee. "If this state wants a judge who is fair, wise, and unshakably honest, you already have her." When he finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat. And then quiet applause began. Ruth's eyes glistened softly, though she remained composed. A moment of peace after the hearing ended. The sun was setting outside the courthouse. Mark waited by the steps as Ruth came out. She looked relieved but calm as always. "How did it go?" he asked. "They'll announce the decision next week," she said. "But whatever happens, I'm at peace." He nodded. "You should be. You've already won in the ways that matter." She smiled warmly. "That's kind of you to say." For a moment they stood quietly, watching the sky turn orange and gold. "You know, Mark," she said, "when I first sat on the bench years ago, I thought justice was only about rules. But life taught me otherwise. It's about people, about those who fall and those who help them stand again." Mark smiled. "That's exactly what you did for me." She looked at him softly. "And what you're doing for others now." The news a week later, it became official. Ruth Harris was appointed to the state Supreme Court. Brookdale celebrated the news proudly. Newspapers ran headlines calling her a voice of fairness and the people's judge. At the community center, young people gathered to cheer her success. Mark was there too, quietly helping set up decorations. When Ruth arrived, the crowd clapped loudly. She spoke briefly, thanking everyone for believing in justice that listens, not just rules. Then she turned to Mark and said into the microphone, "Some people say that one good person cannot change a system. But I say one person who decides to do right can inspire others to do the same." Officer Davis reminded me of that. The room filled with applause again. Mark looked humbled but proud. He didn't like attention, yet in that moment he felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had been part of something greater than himself. A new beginning months passed. Life returned to its calm rhythm. Mark continued his work at the police department, and Ruth began her new role in the state's highest court. One afternoon, he received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, neat and formal, but with warmth in the words. "Dear Officer Davis, you once said that the law should help people do right, not just punish wrong. I wanted you to know that I quoted that in a lecture today to young lawyers. Thank you for reminding me that even those who enforce the law can have the biggest hearts. With respect and gratitude, Judge Ruth Harris." Mark smiled as he read the letter. He folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. Outside his window, children were laughing in the park again, the same park they had both fought to save. He felt at peace. Justice had come full circle, not through power or revenge, but through understanding and respect. Epilogue. The legacy years later, people in Brookdale still talked about Judge Ruth Harris and Officer Mark Davis. Teachers told their story in schools, about how an officer once made a mistake, learned from it and chose to grow, and how a judge responded not with anger, but with grace. Their story became a quiet reminder that justice was not about winning or losing. It was about doing what is right, even when no one is watching. And whenever spring returned to Brookdale, and the flowers bloomed again in that park, the people who remembered would smile and say, "This is what justice looks like, when hearts, not just laws, guide the way." Winter had come early to Brookdale that year. Snow covered the roofs and streets like white blankets, softening the sounds of the busy city. Officer Mark Davis stood outside the police station, sipping a cup of steaming coffee as his breath fogged the cold air. It had been 6 months since the community project began. The program, Second Chance Brookdale, had grown into something real and meaningful. Every week, Mark met with young people who were trying to change their lives. Kids who had once been angry, lost, or alone. He saw parts of himself in them, and helping them gave him a quiet sense of purpose he had never known before. But life, as he was learning, always found a way to test people when they least expected it. A new case one Monday morning. Captain Reed, his supervisor, called Mark into the office. "Mark, close the door," the captain said. His voice was serious. Mark obeyed and sat down. "There's something I need you to handle carefully," Reed continued. "A businessman named Frank Nolan has filed a complaint against a local judge. He claims she showed favoritism in a property dispute." Mark frowned. "A judge?" Reed nodded. "Yes, the name might sound familiar. Judge Ruth Harris." Mark froze. The coffee cup in his hand felt suddenly heavy. Reed didn't notice his reaction. "It's probably nothing, but Internal Affairs wants us to do a basic inquiry. You're one of the few officers who's worked with her in a formal review before, so they're assigning you to gather background notes." Mark hesitated. "Sir, wouldn't that be a conflict of interest?" Reed shook his head. "Not unless you have a personal connection." "Do you?" Mark's mouth went dry. "No, sir. Just professional." "Good," Reed said. "Then keep it that way. Handle this quietly. And remember, the department watches everything closely when a judge is involved." Mark nodded slowly. "Understood." The weight of duties he left the office. Mark felt a knot tighten in his chest. Ruth Harris, the woman who had changed his perspective, who had believed in his ability to grow, was now being accused of wrongdoing. He didn't want to believe it. It didn't fit the person he knew. But rules were rules. He had to investigate. That evening he sat at his desk staring at the open file. The complaint was vague. Nolan claimed that Judge Harris had favored a small community group in a dispute over land ownership. The evidence was weak. A few documents, a few statements. Still, it was enough to trigger an internal review. Mark rubbed his temples. This wasn't what he wanted. He respected Ruth too much to see her name on an accusation, but integrity meant doing the right thing, even when it hurt. A difficult meeting. 2 days later, Mark visited the courthouse. He waited outside Judge Harris's chambers, feeling a mixture of dread and determination. When the clerk called him in, Ruth looked up from her desk in surprise. "Officer Davis," she said, standing. "This is unexpected." Mark took a slow breath. "Your Honor, Ruth, I'm here on official business." Her smile faded. "Official business?" He nodded. "A complaint's been filed regarding one of your recent rulings. I've been assigned to gather basic information. It's standard procedure." Ruth's expression remained calm, though her eyes grew slightly sad. "I see, and you were chosen for this?" "Yes," he said softly. "I tried to refuse, but it wasn't possible." For a moment, silence filled the room. The ticking of the clock sounded louder than usual. Then Ruth said quietly, "You must do your duty, Officer Davis, I understand." Mark met her eyes. "I'll be fair. I promise." "I know you will," she replied. "That's why I'm not worried." Her voice was steady, but he could see a flicker of exhaustion in her face. He wanted to say something comforting, but professionalism kept him silent. He thanked her and left. But as he stepped into the cold hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not with her, but with the people trying to bring her down. Rumors and shadows over the next week. Whispers spread through the department and courthouse alike. Some said Judge Harris had accepted a donation from the community group she ruled in favor of. Others said it was personal bias. Mark checked every lead carefully, reading every report twice. But nothing pointed to corruption, only compassion. She had ruled to protect a public park that a company wanted to turn into a shopping plaza. Her decision followed the law perfectly. The only people unhappy were those who wanted profit. He began to suspect the businessman, Frank Nolan, had filed the complaint out of revenge. But Mark knew suspicion wasn't enough. He needed proof. Late-night clues one night. While reviewing property documents at his desk, Mark noticed something odd. The signature on a land sale agreement from Nolan's company looked different from other signatures in the file. He compared them side by side, the loops, the pressure, the tilt. Someone had forged the date to make it seem as if the company owned the property earlier than it actually did. Mark's pulse quickened. If this was true, then Judge Harris had done nothing wrong. She had ruled against a false claim. He gathered the papers, scanned them, and drove straight to Captain Reed's office, even though it was late. "Captain, you need to see this," Mark said urgently. Reed frowned as he looked through the documents. His expression darkened. "Are you saying Nolan forged evidence?" "Yes," Mark said firmly. "And Judge Harris made the right decision. This complaint is built on lies." Reed leaned back. "That's serious. We'll need verification, but if you're right, this changes everything." Mark nodded. "I'll get whatever proof is needed." The truth revealed. 2 days later, the forgery was confirmed by a handwriting expert. Frank Nolan's company had falsified dates and documents to strengthen their case. The department cleared Judge Harris of any wrongdoing. The official report praised her for judicial integrity and sound judgment. When Mark received the confirmation, he felt relief wash over him like warm sunlight after a storm. He didn't tell anyone how personally grateful he felt. That wasn't part of the job. But deep down he knew he had done what was right, an honest conversation. That evening, Mark visited the courthouse again. Ruth was in her office packing up for the day. She looked up as he entered. "Officer Davis," she said with a tired but gentle smile. "I heard the review has ended." "Yes," Mark said softly. "It's over. The complaint was false. You've been cleared completely." Ruth exhaled slowly, relief visible in her shoulders. "I thought as much. Still, it's good to hear it confirmed." Mark nodded. "I wanted to tell you personally." "And to thank you?" "Thank me?" she asked, surprised. "For teaching me that justice isn't just about rules," he said. "Because if I hadn't learned that, I might not have looked deep enough to find the truth." Ruth's eyes softened. "You honor your badge today, Officer Davis." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I learned from the best." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "Flattery doesn't suit you." He chuckled too, the tension finally breaking. As they stood there, the courthouse lights dimmed behind them, and a quiet snow began to fall outside. A personal invitation before Mark left, Ruth spoke again. "There's something else, Mark. The community center is organizing an award night for the mentors of Second Chance Brookdale. You should attend." Mark shrugged. "I'm not really an award kind of guy." "It's not about the award," she said softly. "It's about reminding people that change is possible." He smiled. "All right, I'll be there." The award night a week later, the community hall was full of people. Warm lights, cheerful music, and the smell of food filled the air. Young people from the program stood proudly, sharing their stories. When Mark's name was called, he walked to the stage as the crowd clapped. He felt awkward at first, but when he looked out at the faces, the teens he'd mentored, the families he'd helped, something in him swelled with quiet pride. Judge Harris was in the audience, smiling. When he met her eyes, it felt like an unspoken message passed between them. We made a difference. When he finished his short speech, the room applauded again. Ruth stood and clapped too, her expression full of warmth and respect. Quiet moments. After the ceremony, they met outside the hall. Snow was falling again, covering the streets in soft white. Ruth wrapped her scarf tighter and smiled. "You spoke beautifully," Mark shrugged, smiling back. "I just said the truth. These kids did the real work. Sometimes, the truth is the most powerful speech of all," she said. They walked together toward the parking lot, the sound of crunching snow under their feet. "You know," Mark said after a while, "I used to think the law was about catching people doing wrong. Now I think it's also about helping them do right." Ruth looked at him thoughtfully. "That's the balance I've always believed in." They stopped near her car. The air was cold, their breaths visible. "You did well, Officer Davis," she said softly. "Brookdale is lucky to have you." He smiled gently. "I think I'm the lucky one, heck, to have met someone who showed me what justice really means." For a moment, their eyes met, not as officer and judge, but as two people who had walked through storms and come out stronger. Then she opened her car door and said with a kind smile, "Until next time, Mark." "Until next time," he replied quietly. A month had passed since the hearing that changed Officer Mark Davis's view of the world. The case was closed and his record remained clean. But something inside him had shifted, a quiet awakening that he couldn't ignore. He went back to his regular duties, but people began to notice a difference in him. He spoke softer, listened more, and smiled occasionally. His fellow officers joked that maybe he had been reprogrammed by a judge. Mark only laughed. He didn't argue because in some strange way it was true. A calm morning, it was early autumn when Brookdale's trees turned golden and the air grew crisp. Mark was assigned to help with a community event, a neighborhood fair organized to build trust between police and citizens. He wasn't thrilled about fairs. He preferred quiet nights and clean reports. But when his captain told him it was mandatory, he agreed without complaint. By mid-morning, the park was full of families, laughter, and the smell of food from nearby stalls. Children ran around with balloons while a small stage was being prepared for speeches. Mark stood near a booth giving out safety pamphlets, watching people go by. Then he saw a familiar face in the crowd, calm, confident, and graceful. It was Judge Ruth Harris. She wasn't wearing her black robe this time, just a simple blue dress and a light scarf. She looked peaceful, carrying a small notebook in her hand. For a moment, Mark didn't know if he should walk up to her. But then she spotted him and smiled warmly. "Officer Davis," she said, approaching him. "Good to see you again." He nodded politely. "Good morning, Your Honor. I didn't expect to see you here." "Please no, Your Honor, today," she said with a gentle laugh. "I'm just Ruth," he smiled faintly. "All right, Ruth." The word felt strange but pleasant on his tongue. They stood for a moment in comfortable silence, watching children play near the fountain. "I didn't know judges attended fairs," he said finally. Ruth chuckled. "Judges are people too, and I like to see the community I serve. It reminds me that the courtroom isn't the whole world." Mark nodded slowly. "You're right. It's easy to forget that." A simple conversation. As they walked around the park together, they talked, not about law or duty, but about ordinary things. Ruth told him she loved gardening but couldn't keep her roses alive this year. Mark admitted he couldn't cook anything more complicated than scrambled eggs. They laughed, surprising even themselves. It felt strange for both, a police officer and a judge sharing jokes like old friends. But there was no pretense, no courtroom walls between them. At one point, Ruth stopped by a small art booth run by children from the local school. She picked up a drawing of a police car beside a smiling sun. "This one's lovely," she said, holding it up. "A little hope on paper." Mark looked at the drawing and smiled. "Maybe one day people will see us like that, not just uniforms, but people trying to help." Ruth nodded softly. "It begins with moments like these." A small incident. Suddenly, a loud noise broke the peace. A young boy had fallen off his bicycle near the edge of the park, crying loudly as people gathered around. Mark rushed forward instinctively. The boy's leg was scraped, bleeding lightly. His mother knelt beside him, panicked. "It's okay, ma'am," Mark said calmly. "He's going to be fine." He took out a small first aid kit from his patrol belt and began cleaning the wound carefully. "Just a scratch." "You're brave, kid." The boy sniffled but managed a small smile. Ruth stood nearby, watching quietly, her expression soft and thoughtful. When Mark finished bandaging the wound, the boy whispered, "Thank you, officer." Mark patted his shoulder. "Take care of that leg. You're a hero now." The mother thanked him several times before leaving. As the crowd dispersed, Ruth walked closer. "You handled that perfectly," Mark smiled. "Just part of the job." Ruth shook her head slightly. "It was more than that. You were gentle. A year ago, would you have done it the same way?" He paused, realizing what she meant. "Maybe not," he admitted. "Maybe I would have just called it in and moved on." She looked at him kindly. "Growth often hides in small moments, Officer Davis." An honest talk later that afternoon, they sat on a bench beneath a tall oak tree. The fair was starting to wind down. People were packing up their booths and the music had softened. Mark leaned back and looked at the sky. "You know, after that hearing, I kept thinking about what you said, about understanding people. It made me look at my work differently." Ruth smiled gently. "That was the hope." He turned toward her. "You really believe everyone can change?" "I believe people can choose to," she said softly. "Change isn't a miracle. It's a decision we make over and over." Mark nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. "Sometimes I wonder if I started too late." Ruth looked at him seriously. "It's never too late to be better. You changed the moment you started asking that question." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the leaves above them, and somewhere in the distance a child laughed. Mark felt something calm settle in his chest. It wasn't attraction, not in a romantic sense, and it was respect. A quiet connection between two people who had seen too much of life's harshness and still believed in kindness. a glimpse into her world as the event ended. Ruth offered him a ride home since her car was parked nearby. He hesitated but then agreed. Inside her car, the faint scent of jasmine filled the air. There were books on the back seat, law journals mixed with poetry collections. Mark picked one up. "You read poetry?" Ruth smiled. "Sometimes it helps me breathe between court sessions." He flipped through the pages and read aloud a line. "Justice without mercy is like light without warmth." She nodded. "That's one of my favorites." He put the book down carefully. "You know, I used to think mercy was weakness, but I don't think that anymore." She glanced at him as they stopped at a red light. "You're learning balance, the hardest thing of all." When she dropped him off near his apartment, he thanked her. "I didn't expect to have such a good day," he said honestly. Ruth smiled. "Maybe it's a sign that good days can start anywhere, even between an officer and a judge." He chuckled. "I'll remember that." As she drove away, Mark watched her car disappear down the street. He felt grateful, not just for the day, but for the change she had brought into his life. The call that night, as he sat in his small living room, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Officer Davis?" said a woman's voice on the other end. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Emily from Judge Harris's office. The judge wanted to inform you about a community project, a program mentoring young people who've had small run-ins with the law. She said you might be a good fit to help." Mark was surprised. "She mentioned me?" "Yes," Emily replied. "She said you have the right balance of firmness and understanding." He smiled faintly. "Tell her I'd be honored to help." New purpose. The following week, Mark joined the project. It was called Second Chance Brookdale. It aimed to guide young adults toward better choices through mentorship instead of punishment. Every Saturday morning, Mark met a small group of teens at the community center. Some were quiet, some defensive, but all of them carried the same tired look he once saw in people he arrested. The look of feeling unseen. At first, they didn't trust him. But he didn't lecture them. He listened. One boy named Aaron reminded him of himself when he was younger, stubborn, proud, and lost. "Why do you even care?" Aaron asked one morning. "You're just a cop," Mark smiled softly. "Maybe because someone once cared enough to make me think about who I was." Aaron looked puzzled but didn't argue. It was a start. Parallel paths. Meanwhile, Judge Harris continued her work quietly, unaware that her words had already started ripples in the community. She handled her cases with the same patience and compassion, but inside, she felt a small warmth knowing that one officer had changed. One evening, as she walked past the community center after work, she saw Mark outside talking to the group of teens. They were laughing about something. She smiled to herself and didn't interrupt. She simply watched for a moment, then turned to leave. Sometimes justice didn't need to wear a robe or hold a gavel. Sometimes it just needed to listen, care, and guide. A quiet realization as. The months passed, Mark found peace in his work for the first time in years. The city hadn't changed much. The same noise, the same problems. But his heart had. He had learned that true authority didn't come from control or fear. It came from compassion. And though he rarely saw Ruth Harris outside of community events or brief greetings, her influence remained with him, like a steady light guiding him forward. That winter, Brookdale saw its first snow. Mark walked down Willow Street, the same street where it all began, and smiled. Life had a strange way of teaching lessons. Sometimes through mistakes, sometimes through people you least expected. The next few days felt heavy for Officer Mark Davis. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the calm face of Judge Ruth Harris behind the bench, her voice steady and clear. He couldn't understand why it bothered him so much. He had stood before many judges during his years in service, usually giving testimony, never as the one being questioned. But something about Ruth Harris made him feel seen, not just as a police officer, but as a person. That was what unsettled him most. On Tuesday morning, Mark sat in the locker room of the police department, staring at the small photo taped inside his locker door. It was old. Him, his ex-wife, and his son Leo smiling at a picnic. Back then, he had promised to be a better father, but work always came first. He sighed deeply. The image of Judge Harris came again, her gentle but serious words echoing in his mind. Sometimes it's about understanding the person in front of you. He closed the locker door quietly. At the courthouse, Judge Ruth Harris sat in her chambers, surrounded by case files and the faint scent of coffee. She looked calm, but her mind was busy. The name Mark Davis had not left her thoughts either. She remembered the night on Willow Street, the rain, the confusion, and the anger in his eyes. She had seen officers like him before, men hardened by the system, shaped by endless pressure and fear. But there was something different about Mark. He had listened, even if only for a moment. Ruth believed in fairness, and not only by law, but by understanding. Her father, who had been a local lawyer, once told her, "True justice is not just about punishment. It's about awakening the heart." She had lived by that. A week passed quickly. The second hearing for Mark's conduct review was scheduled for Thursday morning. That morning, Mark woke early. The sky outside was cloudy, and a soft wind brushed against his window. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, straightened his tie, and whispered to himself, "You're not guilty. You just did your job." But even as he said it, his voice lacked confidence. He arrived at the courthouse early. The halls smelled faintly of paper and polish. People moved about quietly, lawyers carrying files, clerks whispering directions. He sat on a bench outside the courtroom, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest. When the door opened and the bailiff called his name, Mark stood up. "Officer Mark Davis, please enter." He stepped inside. The same wooden benches, the same silence. And there she was, Judge Harris, calm and collected, her black robe flowing as she sat behind the bench. She gave him a polite nod. "Good morning, Officer Davis." "Good morning, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady but unsure. She opened the file in front of her. "We're here to continue the review regarding your conduct on Willow Street. I've also requested a written statement from the witness, which I've read carefully." Mark nodded, hands clasped together. Ruth looked at him for a moment before speaking again. "Officer Davis, do you understand why this review matters?" Mark took a deep breath. "Because every action we take represents the department." "That's true," she said. "But it's also because every action affects another life. Do you see that difference?" He hesitated. "Maybe. Let's talk about that," Ruth said. "Tell me, how long have you been serving as an officer?" 8 years, he replied. "In 8 years," she continued, "how many times have you looked at someone not as a suspect or a threat, but as a person, someone with a story?" The question caught him off guard. He looked down for a moment. "Not often. I don't have that luxury in my job." Ruth leaned slightly forward. "Maybe that's what needs to change." Her words weren't harsh, and they were gentle, almost like advice. Mark met her gaze, confused but thoughtful. "You talk like you've seen both sides of the law." Ruth gave a faint smile. "I have. My father was wrongly accused once when I was a child. That's how I learned that justice isn't just about who's right or wrong. It's about truth, and truth is deeper than reports." Mark said nothing. Her words stirred something inside him, something buried under years of discipline and duty. After the hearing ended, Ruth dismissed him with a polite nod. "We'll reach a conclusion next week. You may go." Mark left the courtroom quietly, his mind full of questions. For the first time, he didn't feel angry about being questioned. He felt curious. Who really was Judge Ruth Harris? And why did her words feel like they were aimed at more than just his job? That afternoon, he sat at a cafe near the station, stirring his coffee without drinking it. The radio played soft music in the background. Across the room, a woman dropped her purse and a young man rushed to help her pick it up. Mark watched quietly. A week ago, he might have suspected the man's intentions, but now he just watched and waited. The woman thanked the man and both smiled. Mark smiled faintly too. Something inside him was changing, slowly but surely. Meanwhile, Ruth visited her elderly mother that evening in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. Her mother, Mrs. Harris, was kind and warm, her hair silver and her eyes still bright. They sat on the porch sipping tea. "You look tired, Ruth," her mother said gently. "Another hard day in court?" Ruth smiled softly. "Not hard, just different. I'm handling a review case involving a police officer. He reminds me of the old days. Strict, silent, and lost in his own walls." Her mother nodded knowingly. "Sometimes people wear their pain as armor. It's how they survive." "Yes," Ruth said quietly. "But what if no one ever teaches them to take it off?" Her mother looked at her thoughtfully. "Then maybe you were meant to be the one who does." Ruth fell silent, watching the sunset fade into gold. Days passed and rumors started to spread inside the police department. Some officers whispered that Mark was in trouble. Others said he had argued with a judge. Mark ignored the talk. He was more focused on his own thoughts. He started noticing things he had once overlooked. The tired eyes of people he questioned, the fear in their tone, the stories behind every complaint. He began to handle calls differently. One night, he stopped a man for a broken taillight. The man was nervous, hands shaking as he handed over his license. "Relax," Mark said calmly. "I'm not here to ruin your night. Just fix the light, all right?" The man looked relieved and thanked him. For the first time in years, Mark felt something he hadn't felt at work: peace. When the next court day arrived, Mark walked in with a strange calmness. He greeted the bailiff politely, took his seat, and waited. Judge Harris entered as usual, professional and graceful. But today there was a small warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. "Good morning, Officer Davis," she said. "Good morning, Your Honor," he replied. Ruth looked at the papers, then spoke. "Before we close this review, I'd like to hear what you've learned from this experience." Mark took a deep breath. "I've learned that doing my job isn't just about rules," he said. "It's about people. Every person I stop, question, or help has a story I don't know. I can't treat them all like they're the same." Ruth listened carefully, nodding slowly. He continued, "I used to think being strong meant showing no weakness, but maybe strength also means being human." A faint smile appeared on her face. "That's a valuable lesson, Officer Davis." She closed the file gently. "This review is concluded. There will be no disciplinary action." Mark blinked in surprise. "You're clearing me?" "Yes," she said softly. "You followed procedure, but more importantly, you learned from the moment. That's what matters most." Mark stood, unsure what to say. "Thank you, Your Honor." "You're welcome," she said, then added quietly, "and thank you for listening." After court, Mark walked out into the sunlight. It was the first time he noticed how warm it felt on his skin. Something inside him had shifted. Not because of punishment, but because of understanding. He realized Judge Ruth Harris wasn't just a woman behind a bench. She was a reminder of something deeper, that justice and compassion could live together, even in a world that often forgot both. That evening, he sat in his car near the same street where it all began. The lights flickered softly and the rain had returned, light and calm. He closed his eyes and smiled. Maybe life wasn't about being right all the time. Maybe it was about being better than you were yesterday. And without knowing why, Mark whispered quietly, "Thank you, Judge Harris." It was a quiet evening in the small city of Brookdale. The streets glowed softly under the streetlights, and a gentle rain tapped against the roofs. Officer Mark Davis sat inside his patrol car, sipping cold coffee. He was tired, frustrated, and a little angry at how his shift was dragging on. Mark had been with the police department for almost 8 years. He was known for being strict, always following the rules and rarely showing emotion. But deep down, Mark carried the weight of his own struggles. Too many long nights, too many bad encounters, and too little rest. That night, the city felt different. The air was heavy and his radio crackled with static. Then a voice came through, sharp and clear. "Unit 12, disturbance on Willow Street near the grocery store. Possible altercation." Mark sighed, tossed his coffee aside, and started the car. The engine rumbled as he turned onto the empty road. When he reached Willow Street, he saw 2 people arguing near the sidewalk. One of them was a woman wearing a gray coat, her umbrella lying broken on the ground. The other person, a young man, was shouting about something Mark couldn't yet hear. Mark parked the car and stepped out, hand resting near his belt. "Hey, what's going on here?" he called out. The young man looked frightened and quickly backed away. "Nothing, officer. Just a misunderstanding." He pointed at the woman. "She dropped her wallet and I tried to help." The woman looked calm, though her voice was firm. "That's not true. He tried to take it." Before things could escalate, the man ran off down the alley. Mark started to chase but stopped when the woman spoke again. "Let him go," she said softly. "It's raining and I don't think he meant harm." "Let's just leave it." Mark frowned. "Ma'am, he tried to steal from you. You can't just let that slide." She looked at him with calm, steady eyes. Sometimes letting go brings more peace than holding on. Mark didn't understand what she meant, but he nodded and took her name for the report. "Your name, ma'am?" Ruth Harris, she said. Something about her name stuck with him, but he didn't know why. After finishing the report, Mark drove away, still thinking about her words. His shift ended 2 hours later, and he went home to his small apartment. He threw his keys on the table and sat in silence. His wife had left years ago, and he rarely saw his teenage son, who lived with her in another city. Sometimes, he wondered if his job had changed him, or if he had chosen this path because he didn't know how to be anyone else. The next morning, Brookdale buzzed with routine life. Children went to school, people opened their shops, and Mark put on his uniform once again. But something was different that day. His supervisor called him into the office. "Mark, we got a complaint about last night," the captain said. Mark blinked. "A complaint? From who?" "The woman, Ruth Harris." Mark frowned. She didn't seem upset. "What did she say?" "She said you were too rough in your questioning and that you made her uncomfortable. We have to look into it." Mark felt his chest tighten. "That's ridiculous. I didn't even touch her. I just asked questions." "I'm not saying you did anything wrong," the captain replied calmly. "But these days perception matters. You'll need to appear before a review board next week." Mark clenched his jaw but nodded. Understood. That evening he drove through the same street again. The rain had returned, heavier than before. The flashing lights of his patrol car reflected off the wet road. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman, her calm voice, her steady gaze, her strange choice to let the man go. He felt angry, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was confusion. He parked near the same corner and stared at the spot where she had stood. Suddenly a soft voice broke his thoughts. "Officer Davis?" He turned and saw Ruth Harris standing there again, holding a grocery bag. "I didn't mean to cause trouble for you," she said. "I only told the truth. I didn't want to file a complaint, but the department called me." Mark sighed. "It's fine. It's just procedure." Ruth tilted her head. "Do you ever wonder why small misunderstandings turn into big problems?" Mark shrugged. "Because people don't listen." Ruth smiled faintly. "Sometimes because people don't look deeper." Her words lingered in his mind long after she walked away. A week later, Mark stood in the Brookdale Municipal Court, nervous but composed. The review hearing was simple, just a few questions before a temporary judge. He was sure it would be over quickly. The courtroom was small, lined with wooden benches. Officers and clerks moved quietly. Mark took a seat at the front, straightening his tie. When the side door opened, everyone stood. The bailiff's voice echoed, "All rise." "The court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Harris presiding." Mark froze. His eyes widened as Judge Ruth Harris walked to the bench in a black robe. It was the same woman from Willow Street. His heart pounded. He felt a rush of disbelief and confusion. Ruth looked composed, her face calm and unreadable. She glanced briefly at him, then turned to the file before her. "Officer Mark Davis," she said. "You are here regarding a conduct review from an incident on Willow Street." Mark swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor." Her tone remained neutral, professional. "Please explain in your own words what happened that evening." Mark hesitated, then told the story exactly as it was. The rain, the argument, the young man who ran away. Her calm voice telling him to let it go. When he finished, Ruth nodded slowly. "Do you believe your actions that night reflected patience and restraint?" Mark frowned. "I followed protocol. I did my job." She looked directly at him then, her eyes kind but firm. Sometimes doing the job is not enough. Sometimes it's about understanding the person in front of you. Her words hit him like quiet thunder. He didn't know what to say. The courtroom was silent for several seconds. Then Ruth closed the file. "This review will be continued next week," she said softly. "You may go." Mark stood frozen for a moment before nodding. "Yes, Your Honor." As he walked out, his mind raced. He couldn't tell if he was angry or embarrassed or something else entirely. That night, Mark sat in his car again, parked under the same streetlight. The rain had stopped, but puddles glimmered on the road. He kept hearing her words in his head. Sometimes it's about understanding the person in front of you. He realized that he had spent years looking at people like problems to solve. Not as people with stories, fears, and reasons, but something about Ruth Harris was forcing him to see differently. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like just a police officer. He felt like a man trying to understand himself. The next day, his colleague Tom noticed he was quieter than usual. "You okay, Mark?" Tom asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark gave a small smile. Not a ghost. Just something I didn't expect. Like what? He shook his head. Like realizing maybe I'm not always right. Tom laughed. Well, that's a first. Mark smiled faintly, but deep down something was changing. He didn't know what awaited him in the next hearing, or what Judge Harris thought of him. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Something bigger than a simple report was happening here. Something that could change the way he saw justice forever.